Ron, thanks for being with us. I want to ask you right away, why did you write Identity Theft as a novel?
Well, I didn't originally write it as a novel. In fact, I didn't even intend to write a book. I have a testimony book called Leave Me Alone, I'm Jewish. It's the first thing I said when someone shared the good news with me. And we were reprinting that, and I wanted to beef up the Jewish roots part, so a Jewish person would understand that it's okay for a Jewish person to believe in Yeshua.
Right.
Well, it just got too big for a chapter, and I said, you know what, let's make a little booklet. Well, the booklet grew up into a book. And then 2 days before I was going to send it in to the publisher, and it was a self-publisher, nobody knows who we are, and we hired a company to publish the book. 2 days before, I had this idea that I had written it incorrectly as a teaching, that it would be far more interesting if it was a novel about a Jewish man discovering the Jewish roots of the gospel through a supernatural visitation. Well, I said, well, that's a great idea for somebody else or another time. I'm done. I've birthed this baby, and in 2 days I'm sending it in.
So this was your first writing project of this scope?
Yes, yes. And I got an email just a couple days later from a woman who had helped me edit the book, and she said, Ron, I had this vision of a butterfly coming out of a cocoon too early, and it never reached its full potential, and it's your book. And I said, no. I said, delete. I am not rewriting this thing. And so another woman emails me a day later, almost the same thing. I sit down with my daughter, Danielle. I said, Danielle, I have this idea. I need to know what you think. She said, Dad, you've got to do it. Well, I'm not John Grisham. I've never written fiction. I've told a lot of fiction, my mother will tell you, but I've never written it. And I sat down to write. I said to Danielle, I'm going to write one chapter, and then tomorrow you'll tell me what you think. Well, I wrote one chapter, and it just flowed. It was fun. And so the next day I sat down with Danielle, I read it to her, and about 3/4 into the chapter that I'd rewritten, she burst into tears. Wow. And when she burst into tears, I burst into tears because I thought she likes it. And I was laughing too because I was realizing, wait, I just made this up yesterday, and it's not fiction because it's based on history. Right. But that's when I said, okay, this could be special.
Well, there's something in it for non-believers, for believers, for Jewish people. Tell me about how you wrote it regarding each people group that's going to be reading it.
Well, when I originally wrote it as a teaching, I certainly wasn't thinking of outreach. But as I began to rewrite it as a novel, and originally it was a teaching book in 3 sections, now it's 3 books, a trilogy. And in the first part of the trilogy, we really discover the Jewish roots of the faith. And as I'm writing it, I'm thinking, if I'm searching, this could push me over. This could be the closer. Well, after it came out, I got an email from an Israeli living in the States, and he said, Ron, I found you on Facebook. Somehow I got your book, and I read it, and I'm the guy in the book. You were speaking to me. Oh my gosh. And he came to faith a few weeks after that, and now we're in contact. So it's a great outreach book, but I didn't write it for that. I wrote it because most Gentile believers don't understand that the ethnicity of Yeshua is significant. Paul said in Romans chapter 9, he said, he starts off by saying, I'm not lying, which is a funny thing for an apostle to say, because we pretty much assume the guy writing the Bible isn't lying. But he says, I'm not lying. I'm telling you the truth. What, Paul? What is burdening you? He said, I would trade my salvation if only the Jewish people would believe. And Paul was revealing not just his heart. He was writing Scripture. He was revealing God's heart for the Jewish people. And what happened... and just to go back, the main reason I wrote the book is because I wanted to answer one specific question. What happened between Acts 15 and 1983? Because in Acts 15, the Bible says that there's a group of Jews. In fact, some of them are Pharisees. A lot of people don't know that some of the Pharisees were born-again believers in the Jewish Messiah, and they continued to identify as Pharisees. And they come together, and they have this big meeting, the first big theological debate, and the question was, what do we do with Gentiles who want to believe in our Messiah? And some of them said, well, they got to become Jewish. And that was obvious. That made sense. It was a revelation that the Gentiles did not have to become Jewish in order to believe in the Jewish Messiah. But for the Jewish guys there, if you had walked up to them and told them that they were no longer Jewish, they would have thought you crazy. They were answering the question about the Gentiles.
Exactly. There's so much the universal situation we're in today. On the other end of Acts 15 is what the issue that's before us now, which is when I become a believer, am I no longer a Jew? Which many of us go through. I think all of us go through.
And that's the first thing I said to myself when I embraced Yeshua in 1983. I said, I'm no longer Jewish. Because nobody told me that. But growing up in America, you can't be Jewish and believe in Jesus.
Exactly.
And to be a Jew means you don't believe in Jesus. At least that's what I was taught.
One defining element.
Right. I could not have told you what I believed as a Jew, but I knew what I didn't believe.
Exactly.
So that's where we wrote the book. We wanted to find out the history. Where was the turning point? And we found that in one of the big turning points was in the year 49. When Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome, Messianic Jews, traditional Jews, he made them all get out of Rome. And when they left, they took with them something very valuable. They took the Torah scrolls, they took the prophets, the writings, and so the young Roman church, they had no Bible. A lot of people don't know it, that there was no book of Romans or Galatians. And so they developed, in the absence of the Jews who had the scriptures, they developed a theology that said God is punishing the Jews. That's why they were kicked out of Rome. He's against them, and that grew up to become replacement theology.
Exactly.
And so 5 or 6 years later, the Jews are allowed to come back into the city of Rome, and they're treated very poorly by the Roman Christians. And Paul hears about it, and he writes the book of Romans. That's why the Romans is so strong in Israel. He wasn't just, writing that in a vacuum. He was addressing a false theology. And in Romans 11, he says, hey guys, this is a big deal. Don't judge Israel. Yes, some of them have been broken off, but God can graft them back in as He's done with us. And you stand by faith. Don't be arrogant, but be afraid. So that was the beginning. Even though Paul pleaded with them, don't turn against Israel, the church did the exact opposite. It got to the point in the Inquisitions where Jews were told, you must become Catholic or you must leave the country. And then many of the Jews who did convert for economic reasons,
survival
reasons, they, it wasn't with their whole heart. And the church was so corrupt at that point. What were they converting to?
Exactly.
But the church had spies. I mean, it was like Cuba or Iran. They would come to your house and they would check on Friday night to see if you were lighting Sabbath candles. And if you were doing anything Jewish, if you simply just refused pork, the church would arrest you. And you would be burned alive. That was your punishment.
Paul has gotten so much of the blame for this. And there's so often you hear that Paul invented Christianity as if it was apart from Jewishness. You do a really good job in the book of pointing out the 9 instances where Paul himself goes to the Jew first. It says that in Romans 1:16. He actually does it throughout Acts. And you hear that he is reaching for the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. I have friends who said, it didn't work with the Jews, so he went to the Gentiles. But that's not what his heart was.
No, and it did work with the Jews. One of the misnomers is that the Jews rejected Jesus. Now, it is true that as a leadership, that's where the Jewish leadership came down. We don't believe in him. But there was a revival in Jerusalem. The Bible says in Acts chapter 2 that 3,000 men plus women and children came to faith. And after that, it grew to 5,000 plus women and children. And then when Paul comes back to Jerusalem, and if they're blaming Paul, but his heart, I want to go to Jerusalem. In fact, he says, I'm willing to die just to get back to Jerusalem. He gets back to Jerusalem where he meets a guy named Jacob, who most people know as James, another misnomer. James is a great name if you're a chauffeur or if you're a butler, but the brother of Yeshua's name was not James, it was Jacob. Another place where they ethnically cleansed the Jewishness of the new covenant so that it doesn't seem Jewish. Well, he meets Jacob and the other apostles, and Jacob says to him, look, Brother Saul, Brother Paul, how many tens of thousands of Jews have believed, and they're zealous for the Torah. Isn't that interesting?
Both and,
Right. So number one, we see that in many folks' Bibles it says thousands, but the Greek is, you said it's myriads, which means tens of thousands. And it doesn't say, and they've left Judaism. It says they're zealous for the Torah. That's crazy if the Torah is bad, as many people teach. But Paul says in Romans 7, the Torah is good,
Yes.
spiritual,
Yes.
and holy. We were the problem. But now under the new covenant, under grace, these tens of thousands of Jewish believers that Jacob speaks to Paul about are empowered to live out the law, not under compulsion, but as a means of calling.
Yes. This is really exciting. I can't wait to hear some more about this. We'll be back after this.